Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? If you are watching this video right now, then there is a very good chance that you have survived the first round of your fantasy playoffs and you're heading into round 2. So congratulations for taking another step towards a fantasy championship this season. And hopefully a lot of you were on a bye last week, because if you were, then you were not stressing some of the absolutely terrible performances that we saw. We had some top guys do absolutely nothing for us, and we had some injuries that may have affected you as well. But just because we're in the playoffs does not mean that we should not be working the waiver wire. We're just working the waiver wire a lot differently than what we have this season. Once you get into the fantasy playoffs, it's all about this week and then potentially next week as well. We're playing for what guy can help us immediately. We're not stashing guys for later in the season or anything like that. The only stashes that we're making right now are for backups to our running backs in case we deal with an injury. But first and foremost, let's talk about some things that we learned this past week, and really it revolves around the playoff picture, because that's going to affect our fantasy teams more than anything over the next couple of weeks. Right now we have 3 teams who have clinched their division already, and then we have 3 teams who have clinched a bye but could still improve their seeding or win the division or switch to a wild card. The Chiefs, Bills, and Texans in the AFC have all clinched their division. The Lions, Eagles, and Vikings in the NFC have all clinched a playoff spot. Now, those are going to be things that we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a second, because even though they have secured their playoff spots, it doesn't mean that they're not still playing for something. And there has been 9 teams that are already eliminated from the playoff picture. Now, the teams that have already been eliminated, that doesn't mean that they're just going to sit all their players either. But those are the teams where we really need to be paying attention to running back handcuffs. The Jets, Browns, Jags, and Titans, plus the Pats, Raiders, Bears, Panthers, and Giants. All of them out of the playoff picture. And when you take a look at those eliminated teams, they're not going to be resting guys just to rest guys, but they could potentially shut down players who have suffered some sort of an injury and they don't want it to carry too far into the offseason. That's where running back handcuffs become extremely important. So teams like the Panthers with Chuba Hubbard, they just signed him to a long-term deal, and Jonathan Brooks is already going to miss a majority, if not all, of next season. So maybe we need to keep an eye on his backup, because if he were to suffer an injury, they may not want to bring him back in either of the final 2 weeks of the season. The same could be said for like the Jags and Travis Etienne or Tank Bigsby. Also, it could be said for Ramondre Stevenson and the Patriots and Breece Hall and the Jets. So if you have a running back from an eliminated playoff team, make sure you have their handcuff available to you in case something were to happen and they are not available to play in your lineup. But even though we've had a few teams already secure a playoff spot, there are 23 teams with 3 weeks left that still have not been mathematically eliminated from the playoffs, which is great for us, because if they're still playing for something, then their stars are still going to be out on the field and we can use them in our lineup. But we'll be keeping an eye on teams like the Chiefs and the Bills, because they're still fighting for home field advantage. The Lions and the Eagles are still fighting for home field advantage as well. So over the course of the next few weeks, they're not going to be sitting any of their stars, because they need to secure home field advantage, and of course that bye in the first round. Now, a guy like Patrick Mahomes, it sounds like he's going to be missing time anyway. But if the Chiefs were to win this week and the Bills were to lose, the Chiefs clinch home field advantage, you can almost certainly expect their starters to be rested not only in week 17 but potentially in week 18 as well. And that is where we would run into issues. So while we should still be pretty set heading into week 16 for a lot of our superstars to be out on the field, championship weekend could become a big issue. But we need to make sure that we talk about some of the injuries we saw from this past weekend as well. And I already mentioned his name, Patrick Mahomes. He's dealing with an ankle injury, which feels like it's something that creeps up on him every single season. But this week could end up costing him the rest of the regular season, because it does sound like he's going to be week to week at this point. If he was day to day, I would say he's probably got a good shot at playing, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem like he may be playing the rest of the regular season. And if that happens, then you're definitely going to need to be finding another quarterback right now. But probably a lot of Patrick Mahomes owners had already shifted to somebody with much higher upside, so you may still be okay. Now, Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts also ended up being banged up this past week. Josh Allen, it definitely sounds like it was only precautionary and there's absolutely nothing wrong. I'm not worried about him. Jalen Hurts has a finger injury on the non-throwing hand and he balled out this past week. So neither of those guys I'm worried about. Geno Smith is definitely one that could also end up missing some time as well with a knee injury, which if it does happen, Sam Howell would end up stepping in his place. Now, I'm not worried about missing Geno Smith. I'm just worried about the players around the quarterback position than I am about playing Geno Smith, because Smith really wasn't a fantasy viable quarterback recently anyway. Unfortunately, at the running back position, Nick Chubb wasn't a guy that we were really relying on anyway right now, but for him to suffer a broken foot after just getting back from his knee injury is not great. It shouldn't affect him heading into next season all that much, but he is going to be a free agent very soon, and we'll see what ends up happening with that and where he may end up landing. From fantasy perspective, though, we'll talk about Jerome Ford, obviously, as being a guy to replace him. Alvin Kamara, he's dealing with an injury right now as well. That might be one that we have to try and keep an eye on. Kendre Miller is going to come up here in just a second. And then, of course, Tony Pollard as well, who was dealing with an ankle injury heading into last week. Did seem a little bit limited, and towards the end of that game, we saw a lot of Tajay Spears. So we'll need to keep an eye on whether or not Tony Pollard is going to be active next week. Jalen Waddle, Alec Pierce, and Xavier Legette are the three main wide receivers that we're keeping an eye on. And with Jalen Waddle, he was really up and down anyway. And with the Dolphins still technically in the playoff picture and not eliminated just yet, we might see him pushed back, but I don't know if he's going to be ready to go either, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. Xavier Legette isn't a guy that we were starting consistently. Alec Pierce isn't a guy that we were starting consistently either. However, Alec Pierce being down could lead to some more Adonai Mitchell or some more targets, at least to guys like Josh Downs. And Zach Ertz is in the concussion protocol as well, and there's going to be an opportunity for him to miss next week. So while I'm not really looking at his backup, we may have to shift to another tight end if you've been utilizing Zach Ertz. All right, but let's start talking about some players that we may be targeting on the waiver wire this week. And let's start with running backs, because clearly when you're talking about running backs in the fantasy playoffs, they tend to be the most important player that we really need to keep an eye on. Now, the top three running backs we're going to talk about on the waiver wire this week are guys that have players in front of them who are currently dealing with injuries. If Tony Pollard misses this week, Tajay Spears could definitely be in line for a decent amount of work. And since he's going up against the Indianapolis Colts, that could definitely be a favorable matchup for him, where we could actually start him as some sort of a flex option this week, especially if Mason Rudolph is the quarterback and we're seeing some of those dump offs to him in the passing game. In a PPR league, Tajay Spears could absolutely have a lot of flex potential this week. Now that Chubb is dealing with a broken foot, we're going to see more Jerome Ford over the last few weeks, and this is kind of an audition for Jerome Ford once again, because he kind of got left to the wayside earlier in the season. With no Nick Chubb, he wasn't really being utilized all that much. But this past week, we saw a lot from him that he did in 2023. Maybe not the most efficient back in the world, but he is going to give you some big explosive plays. So he's going to be volatile at times, and he's already highly owned as it is, so he may not be available to you. But going up against Cincinnati, that could be another opportunity to see some decent fantasy points. Now, Kendre Miller going up against Green Bay may not be the one matchup that I really want to rely on all that much. But if Alvin Kamara ends up missing this week, Kendre Miller is going to see a lot of those touches. The old coaching staff kind of dismissed Kendre Miller, and if you bought our draft guide, I talked about Kendre Miller as a potential breakout candidate this season. But again, he was injured earlier in the year, and the coaching staff in place really didn't seem to be very favorable of his standing on the team. But the coaching staff that's in place now has been trying to get him some work. So it'll be interesting to see, if we don't have Alvin Kamara this week, do they give him the full workload and really try to find out, is Kendre Miller a big part of their future plans? And we'll go ahead and mention Justice Hill. Derrick Henry coming off a really tough week this past week, and now they're going to be going up against a Pittsburgh defense that may be without TJ Watt. Now, if they are, then that does make them a little bit more vulnerable, but it doesn't negate the fact that Pittsburgh's defense is still really solid. So depending on what Baltimore does, if this is a closer matchup, we could see Justice Hill out there a little bit more this week, given the fact that he had a decent workload last week. Really, for him, he's only going to be startable in PPR leagues. If you're in half or standard, I would definitely be looking to go somewhere else. All right, and moving on to wide receivers, once again, we are looking at guys that that may be able to help us right away. I'm not looking at holding wide receivers that could help me in week 17 or 18. I need guys that could help me in week 16 and beyond. Jalen Coker had 110 receiving yards, a touchdown, and caught 4 of his 6 targets. And with Xavier Legette being injured, there is going to be an opportunity for more volume for him moving forward. And we've already seen him make a little bit of a fantasy impact this season. And with Carolina playing from behind a majority of the time, that's just more target advantage for him. Jalen McMillan, after 75 yards and another touchdown, now has 3 TDs over the last 2 weeks. And he's a guy that's being looked at in the red zone by Baker Mayfield. Now, Mike Evans gave us a huge day and still saw some big plays, but when we get down closer to the goal line, Jalen McMillan is still being looked at. And with Tampa Bay playing Dallas and maybe having an opportunity for some big plays there and potentially some back and forth given the fact that Tampa Bay's defense isn't all that good either, Jalen McMillan could see the same type of workload this week that he has seen the last couple of weeks. Tim Patrick also has 3 touchdowns over his last couple of weeks, and he's a guy that's out targeting Jameson Williams right now, even though Jameson Williams is actually taking advantage of his big plays a little bit more. Tim Patrick doesn't have a ton of upside for me, but he's definitely being looked at by Jared Goff quite often, and as the number 3 option, maybe even number 4 option right now, he's the guy that's kind of being left open by opposing defenses. The Lions have a tough matchup on the road at Chicago with that secondary this week, and knowing that a lot of their attention is going to be drawn to Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, and Sam Laporta, who all had good games this past week, Tim Patrick once again could be that number 4 option that sees an okay floor because Jared Goff will look his way in a pinch. Keon Coleman is a guy that I'm really only looking at in deeper leagues. He's a guy that's going to be very big play dependent and is not going to see a ton of volume. But in this matchup, he absolutely could find himself with a couple of big plays down the field, knowing that New England does give up quite a few receiving yards. If you're looking at Keon Coleman, deeper leagues where you're needing to take a stab at somebody with some decent upside because maybe you're a lower seed playing a higher seed. Elijah Moore sucked in week 15, but he saw 6 more targets, and that is definitely good for his potential floor moving forward. Again, his floor this past week was awful, but if we're looking for guys getting targets, Elijah Moore is definitely one of them that is seeing a consistent amount of volume here as of recent. Calvin Austin caught all 5 of his targets for 65 yards this past week, a decent floor play, especially in this matchup going up against a terrible Baltimore secondary, and no George Pickens likely again. Calvin Austin may be one of the safer options on the waiver wire right now. Malik Washington could be stepping in for Jalen Waddle over the next couple of weeks, and he actually led the team in receiving this past week, which is crazy to think when you have Jonnu Smith and Tyreek Hill, who were both playing substantially well heading into this game. Malik Washington is a guy that I covered in depth this past season. I really like his explosive ability, and we might be able to see some of that over the next couple of weeks, although from a fantasy standpoint, he's highly volatile. Rashad Bateman going up against Pittsburgh is not the best matchup in the world for him, and if you pick up Rashad Bateman to play him, you're hoping for a lot of neutral game script or Baltimore to be in some sort of negative game script, and we're also hoping for a big play touchdown. Consistent volume is not the name of the game with him, but it's really going to depend on how much Baltimore throws the ball. Noah Gray somehow continues to be fantasy viable, even with Travis Kelce on the team. Another touchdown and another 5 targets this past week, and he's a guy that if you're looking for a stab in the dark that you just hope can score a touchdown, he's definitely one of those options. But it is also concerning trying to play him knowing that Patrick Mahomes may not be the quarterback this week. Pat Freiermuth is over 60% owned on a majority of platforms, but if for some reason he is still out there in one of your leagues, absolutely he is the number 1 tight end off the waiver wire right now. A great matchup coming up for him. He's been scoring touchdowns and he's been really good with no George Pickens, and that's going to continue this week. With no Evan Ingram this past week, Brenton Strange saw 12 targets and caught 11 of them. He's a guy that was even fantasy viable viable when there was no Evan Ingram earlier in the season with Trevor Lawrence. And now you got Mac Jones, who's opting to be a little bit safer at times, checking down to him. He is absolutely, in PPR leagues, a guy that we should be looking at as a top 12 tight end option. And then Chigiooko, he saw 10 targets this past week as well with Mason Rudolph. Now, I'm not convinced that we're picking up Chigiooko. He's definitely a deep league stash that if you are just a shot in the dark, there's no tight ends available, and you need someone with some big play upside, then we'll go with Chigiooko. But that is the only reason I'm looking at him. Now, if you're dealing with some poor quarterback play or you need to stream somebody because you're dealing with an injury, I've got 3 guys that we'll take a look at next week with Jameis Winston, Cooper Rush, and Aaron Rodgers. Jameis Winston has the most upside of all of these guys, but he also has probably the most volatile floor with the fact that he has thrown 8 interceptions over the last 3 games. Take what you will with Jameis Winston. If you're playing for big plays from him, you also know that he's going to lose some points with turnovers. Cooper Rush, a little bit safer going up against Tampa Bay. He's got a great opportunity against that secondary and definitely could have a very well-established floor that is safe for you this week if that's what you need. For those of you dealing with an injury to like Patrick Mahomes and you're a top seed with a matchup you feel that you're favorable in this week, then we take a look at Cooper Rush just to kind of get us through and get us the bare amount of fantasy points that just don't tank us. And then Aaron Rodgers, he's 34% owned just like Jameis Winston, and I feel like he's probably not on the waiver wire for a lot of leagues, but he does have back-to-back top 12 performances now, and now he's got a matchup against the LA Rams, who also give up quite a few passing yards. Now, this past week in that sloppy mess in San Francisco doesn't really count, but this week going up against the Jets with Devontae Adams clicking all of a sudden and Garrett Wilson doing his thing, we definitely could see Aaron Rodgers with some top 12 potential again. All right, what defenses do we want to potentially stream this week? We're going to take a look at the Falcons, number 1, going up against the New York Giants and probably Drew Lock, knowing that Tommy DeVito is in the concussion protocol. Drew Lock has not looked great this season, and he hasn't thrown for a ton of yards, so interception opportunities will end up being there, but he doesn't have a very high ceiling anyway. The Cardinals going up against Carolina could be a decent streaming option as well. Carolina has definitely kept games closer over the last couple of weeks, but their offense isn't super explosive either. So if the Cardinals can get a couple of sacks with Bryce Young and maybe even cause a turnover or 2, they should give you a solid fantasy day. The Packers going up against New Orleans could be a very solid bet. The turnover potential against Spencer Rattler is absolutely there. Plus no Alvin Kamara either. The Green Bay Packers could be in line for a couple of turnovers, low yardage, and of course getting into the backfield. And when it comes to players that we're taking a look at dropping right now at this point of the season, because we're talking about so few fantasy rosters still out there, I'm not going to blanket cover a bunch of guys that you should just end up dropping. Right now we're being very strategic with our moves, so if there's some moves that you're interested in making, leave them down in the comments below, and either A, other members of Headliner Nation can give you their thoughts, or B, Jake or myself will hop into the comments as much as possible and try to give you some feedback towards some of those moves as well. But Headliner Nation, we're kicking off week 16 here on the waiver wire video. Hopefully your rosters are looking solid, and hopefully you're still alive for something in your fantasy playoffs and you didn't take a round 1 exit with some of those awful performances we saw last week. Let me know down in the comments if you're still alive and how you're feeling about your roster right now, but also hit that like button on the way out, subscribe to the channel if you're new here, and make sure that you turn the notifications on. I cannot stress this enough. Turn your noties on so anytime that we drop new content or go live, you'll know about it right away. Headliner Nation, I'm going to get out of here. Peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.